Spoilers for the Archon quest Chapter 3, Act 6, Caribert. For such a short quest, we got so much lore. Answers? Huh, you thought. But we learned a lot, and I desperately want to talk about the curse and the sinner. Oh, and Kaeya, obviously. I'm first going to do a little summary of the quest for anyone who got confused about what was actually going on, so feel free to skip ahead for the analysis and speculation. You meet up with Kaeya. He tells you he's an Alberich from Khaenri'ah, which is near Sumeru. Dane randomly drops by to order a Death Afternoon, Kaeya's favorite drink, and they chat. They seem to not know each other, though Dane recognizes his last name, pointing out that he's a descendant of the Abyss Order. Kaeya seems to have not known this, which is weird, but we'll come back to it. Kaeya leaves to go do some business, and Dane explains he's in town because while he was recovering for the past year, he remembered the Abyss sibling mentioning the Loom of Fate while they were traveling in the past, long before the events of We Will Be Reunited. You go to a video forest and do some mystery solving and come across a house with a box that contains a broken mirror. Dane wanders off to go investigate some ley lines while you hang out with Paimon. You fall asleep and Dane wakes you up, but goes off into the forest. Paimon is nowhere to be found. Now, you think this is just a continuation of the ley line investigation, but what is actually happening is a misdirection because this Dane isn't talking to you. You are experiencing your siblings' memories from their perspective, when sibling and past Dane were once here in Avidia. So you go in search of Paimon, not realizing this is your sibling's memory. You run into a very mercurial character named Eide, who is keeping a hilichurl in his house. You talk to him and learn he's from Khaenri'ah, and he super hates the gods and the Seven, given that Khaenri'ah got dunked on and was cursed by them. Eide explains that even though Khaenri'ah began with a single bloodline, it was a nation where anyone turning their backs to the gods could come and live, but the full-blood Khaenri'ahns like Dane were the greatest sinners, and they were cursed with immortality, while those with blood from the domains of other gods transformed into hilichurls. Eide goes on to explain that the hilichurl is his illegitimate son, Caribert, who he had with a woman from Mondstadt. Eide is trying to make a medicine to recover Caribert's consciousness. To do that, it uses special mushrooms, grown with potentially dead wife fertilizer, and Sumeru specialties, but also requires the blessing of the God of Wisdom. So there's a lot of going back and forth trying to figure out the formula and dosage, and also yelling at the Statue of Seven. You stumble upon another hilichurl who you follow into a cavern. You encounter a fortune lector, but Traveler makes a mental note that they don't seem to be a part of the Abyss Order. Of course, not knowing that this is a memory and the Abyss Order has yet to be formed. Eide is completely enamored with the lector, understandably. Also, he's definitely not Kaeya because this is your sibling's memory from 500 years ago. You see that the hilichurls and now Eide are bowing and kneeling to this big crystal, chained up like the defiled statue. You hear a mysterious voice who says a bunch of cryptic stuff, but says that he is no god, just a sinner. The stone sends some purple energy to Eide, and he comes out of his trance with a new religious zealotry. You leave the cavern to go give Caribert more medicine, but instead of going back to the Statue of Seven for a blessing, Eide figures the purple energy blessing will work instead. Definitely no red flags here. But it does work, and Caribert regains his consciousness, but is horrified that he is turned into a monster. Eide frantically explains that the destruction and red skies of Khaenri'ah are no longer, and they're just in a fairy tale. Eide tries to return to the cavern, but finds it's gone, and Caribert also disappears. Eide panics because it seems like Caribert took off his mask, which Eide told him not to do under any circumstance, and shattered the mirror, seeing the horror of his own reflection. Traveler thinks that, wasn't it already broken? Because they still don't realize this is a memory from long past. You find Caribert, but he seems different. Tragically, this child is clearly suffering, so again he takes off his mask with an ominous burst of purple energy. Traveler loses consciousness and wakes up to Eide, rejoicing. He reveals that he had given a false name. His real name is Chlothar Alberich. Yes, Alberich. But he's rejoicing because he realized that the power that was within Caribert and also the mysterious voice of the sinner was the power of the abyss. And now, Caribert can become the loom of fate. It's then revealed that Eide, or more accurately, Chlothar Alberich, has not been talking to you, but the prince or princess of Khaenri'ah, your sibling, and you've been experiencing their memories from their perspective. You then wake up, for real this time, to Paimon and Dane explains the Abyss was tampering with the ley lines. You ask him about its founder, and it turns out Chlothar Alberich created the Abyss Order, but after 100 years of descending into madness, disappeared. But obviously the Abyss Order lives on, with your sibling siding with them. At this point, you and Dane dig up some graves and find some skeletons? It's Chlothar, and he was buried next to what I assume is his love for Mondstadt, who died long before he did. But Dane points out that, to die, Chlothar must have found a way to dispel the curse of immortality. And remember, in the last quest, Dane said it was impossible to do this. Finally, Dane decides it's time to disappear for another year or so on a cliffhanger. He says that it's better for us to split up because he may have seen us. Dane doesn't give us any details aside from the fact that time and memory is no obstacle to the sinner. And that's all the major plot beats of the quest. So the Abyss Order formed after the Cataclysm ended, and after seeing what happened with Chlothar and Caribert, the sibling joined and rose in their ranks. Chlothar tells us that the curse of immortality is a gift by the gods to the greatest sinners, or the full-blooded Khaenri'ahs. Those not from the original single bloodline are those that transformed into hilichurls as a curse of the wilderness. Taken at face value, and assuming he's reliable and knowledgeable about the nature of the curse, he seems to imply two very different curses based on your bloodline. But this would contrast with what I previously speculated about hilichurlism. Similar to Elazar, Deshret's plague, and Shirye's plague, it was a consequence of abyssal corruption, and the real curse was immortality. Elazar is a consequence of the withering and the corrupted Irmin soul. Shirye fell into a chasm and brought back the abyss, thanks Lilupar. And with King Deshret, this was associated with forbidden knowledge. And, of course, Khaenri'ah had a little tango with forbidden knowledge around the Cataclysm. In the limited descriptions we do have, they're not completely the same, with some of them having more similarities with others, but there's specific language about scale-like scabs, necrosis and ulcers, scabs forming new skin, and losing faces and language that seems intentional. And for what it's worth, Chlothar makes a medicine using regional specialties to cure Caribert, and it's known that lotuses in the forest themselves can curb the effects of Elazar. So this is speculation, and maybe I'm wrong completely, but I'm inclined to think there's just one curse. It's immortality, and it affected all Khaenri'ahs. Abyssal corruption turned people into hilichurls. This kind of falls apart though when trying to explain why some turned into hilichurls and some didn't. And I just don't want to speculate too much on that, because if there is a connection, then we're missing some key information. So perhaps we can just believe Chlothar that there are two different curses. Okay, regardless of how many curses there actually are, the immortality curse of the great sinners seems awful. Chlothar fell in love and his loved one died before he ever would. And Caribert, his own son, turned into a hilichurl. Watching your loved one suffer and die while you live on endlessly would be terrible. You endure erosion and decay anyway, but losing loved ones really forces and amplifies the trauma and madness. So, in a sense, it could also be considered a curse of love, which I think would be interesting to compare to another curse of love we know, the Seelie curse, where they lose their bodies and minds if they fall in love. Not that there's much to compare and contrast anyway, except for maybe Scaramouche saying that love is a form of sin, and full-blooded Khaenri'ahs were the greater sinners. Probably unrelated though, and has more to do with the whole destroying the world thing during the Cataclysm. But going back to diseases and plagues though, I have a bit of a tangent. There's something else the different afflictions have in common. Elazar is restricted to being a Sumeru phenomenon, and Shirie's plague, as well as King Deshret's plague, was also in the Sumeru deserts. And now we learn from Kaeya that Khaenri'ah was near Sumeru, so roughly beneath, I assume. So I wonder then, given the parallels between the manifestations of the curse, the plague, and Elazar, now there seems to be somewhat of a geographic similarity. And now, think of it this way. Above ground, you have the God of Wisdom, who is an avatar of the Irminsul born from its branches. On the other side, you have a king named Irmin who has unknown connections with Irminsul. So I can't help but to think that it makes sense that, well, Irminsul is roughly here, or at least its core, its center. And in some ways, you could think of the Sumeru and Khaenri'ah region being what you would call the Axis Mundi, or the center of the world. Just some food for thought. I wish we had more screen time with Kaeya, but boy, did we learn some things. One is that Dainsleif is full-blooded Khaenri'ah, coming from the original single bloodline. Later we learned that Chlothar Alberich, the founder of the Abyss Order and an ancestor of Kaeya, was also full-blooded. As for Kaeya, we have two options. Either he's full-blooded, or he isn't. Based on the fact that Kaeya is not a Hilichurl, it may be safe to assume that Kaeya is also full-blooded. I think that's what Dane might have assumed, knowing he's an Alberich and also not a Hilichurl. But it's also heavily implied that he isn't full-blooded. There's a lot of zooming into the eyes to point out the star-shaped pupils. But this also highlights the difference. Chlothar and Dane have very pronounced, large, primogem star outlines, while Kaeya's is relatively smaller. Also, Kaeya has this line saying, "Oh, so you're a full-blooded Khaenri'ah," which, when you think about it, is weird because it sounds like he doesn't identify as that himself. But regardless, this discussion misses the bigger point. Regardless of being a half-blood or a full-blood, he seems to not have either the curse of immortality or the curse of Hilichurlism. Perhaps he's so far descended that he can escape its effects, but that just seems messy. But we know that he is a descendant of Chlothar Alberich, and it's implied that Chlothar cured the curse, for himself at least. So I wonder if Kaeya is Khaenri'ah's last hope because he was cured of the curse long before an endless lifetime of torment and suffering. But I think all of this is very intentionally ambiguous. And personally, the only question that I really care about right now is who is Kaeya's cool pirate grandpa? And what was that sword from Celestia? Okay, but to quickly circle back to the descendant of the Abyss Order founder thing, it's implied in the quest that Kaeya doesn't know about the Abyss Order origins and only suspected it. I'm honestly unsure if he's keeping his knowledge secret. Kaeya having more ties to the Abyss Order would explain some things. Like in the Mondstadt Archon quest, where he investigated shadowy figures with his Riz and linguistic abilities, and he knows Hilichurl language. Also, in Diluc's story quest, the Knights receive a letter from the Abyss Order, and Diluc comments that they're also sending a message to their own. Diluc may also know a thing or two, I'm just saying. But, also, he technically didn't say no to Paimon's question about involvement with the Abyss Order. At the end of the day, though, what Mona said in her voice line for Kaeya is probably the most true. That he's torn between his found family and his new home, and his real father, his bloodline, and Khaenri'ah. So we hear a mysterious voice while we're looking at the crystal. He says he is not a god, only a sinner. Like I said before, Chlothar is trying to make a medicine to cure Caribert, and he basically substitutes the blessing from the God of Wisdom for a blessing from the sinner. He gives it to Caribert, who becomes the Loom of Fate through the sinner's abyssal power. Still don't know what the Loom of Fate is, but okay. The sinner seems to have a lot of ties to fate, as he says that he can see our siblings' fate and even encourages our sibling to transcend above their fate. Also, the fortune lector we face is the secret keeper of Fate's End, and I guess the name of the cavern is Fate's End itself. So definitely a subtle theme of defying fate. So, who is this? Dane has his suspicions, but he still wants to split because the sinner may have seen you, because memory and time isn't an obstacle for him? Between the Abyssal Blessing, being in this mysterious disappearing Fate's End, projecting his voice into your head, and the whole time isn't an obstacle thing, I'm inclined to think this dude is powerful and omnipotent. So, here are 3 options. Number 1. Nibirius. Albedo and Rhindaughter found an artifact deep in a dungeon, and Rhindaughter disappeared, leaving Albedo and Mondstadt. This artifact was the heart of Nibirius. We know nothing else. But it was deep in a dungeon, and also Rhindaughter, the greatest sinner of all, disappeared right after that. That's all I have. Number 2. The second who came. Over time, the more and more I've thought about it, the more I think the second throne is the Abyss. It brought illusions, delusions, broke the shackles of the world. Oh, but it also brought a lot of destruction. And as I've said many times, the Primordial One's celestial nails were used to mend the land, and they can ward off abyssal powers. So maybe this mysterious voice coming from a rock is the embodiment of the Abyss, the second throne. And, as some further speculation, it could be really interesting if the concept of fate is something the Primordial One intended for the world, but the sinner sin was the gift of dreaming something beyond your intended fate, especially if those illusions are twisted and dangerous. Or the sin could have just been all the destruction. But also, random thought, what if the rock is a meteorite that pierced the firmament? The chasms had a bunch of meteorites in it, right? Alien sky rocks falling into a big hole. Yeah. Number 3. Irmin, the King of Khaenri'ah. Hey, remember in my patch 3.5 thoughts video, I said it'd be super cool if the voice were omnipotent, like Odin watching the world with his ravens. And I also have Irmin brain rot? I mean, I've already made like 3 billion videos on this dude. Did you think I wouldn't find an excuse to talk about him more? Okay, so, lightning round. Khaenri'ahns are bowing to their king. Maybe unknowingly, but instinctually compelled. They feel comforted at home. Fate's End gives this feeling of peace, the same as the deathly statuettes. The Black Serpent Knights who drop them are also literally in the chasm. He's likely the sage who hung himself from a tree and gained secret knowledge of runes, and if the Odin comparison holds up, likely exchanged an eye for wisdom, and had ravens that watched the entire world for him. In the book Legend of the Shattered Halberd, he's the first divine halberd who pierced the Axis Mundi and connected the realms. Dane said he had his suspicions, and he of all people would know who Irmin is. This option would mean Irmin is very powerful and omnipotent. Perhaps he didn't start this way though. I wonder if he, like vision users, was an Allogene, with the ability to ascend to godhood. Instead of ascending to Celestia, he ascended to the Abyss. Kinda like how Clothar swapped a blessing of the Seven for a blessing of the Abyss. Oh, and particularly in the pursuit of forbidden knowledge. And perhaps he became the king or even a god of the Abyss. Or perhaps his ability to transcend time and memory, maybe it simply has more to do with piercing the Axis Mundi and his unknown relationship or connection to Irminsul. Alternatively, maybe he can transcend time and fate because he's a shade. Maybe like Istaroth, but just did a heel turn against his stupid dad. And that's why Khaenri'ah was not only a godless nation, but specifically restricted texts about the Seven. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, am I right, guys? Although maybe the shade of death or fate might be its own option, but I just don't have anything substantial to go on that for now. Not that I do anyway, but I digress. So people have pointed out that, well, why wouldn't the sibling have recognized the voice talking to them? Well, we don't actually know when the sibling was summoned, and we are only experiencing their memories, not necessarily the consciousness or feelings of the sibling. And a completely bonkers idea that I personally find really cool. As Dane said, time and memory is no obstacle for him. What if everything we saw and experienced was a memory, but he was actually addressing us? I'm just saying. So I think these are all compelling options, although it could be someone or an entity we don't know about yet. More food for thought. There's obviously still a lot of story to unfold, but we were given a major chunk of lore to deal with. This video is already too long. Thanks for watching the video. Please like, subscribe, and comment, and buy that notification bell a death afternoon sometime. I co-host a stream over on twitch.tv/owletdesu, so drop by. We talk lore, character analysis, we voice story quests, and we get a little silly. So, thanks again, take care, bye!